Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be talking about, well, tackling, I guess you could say, a decision that almost everybody in India has to face at some point, right? Whether to buy a house or just stick with renting. Such a, I don't know, weighty choice. Not just about, money, but about like expectations and stuff too.
Yeah, for sure. It's not just a pure numbers game, right?
Yeah.
You got to factor in your hopes and dreams for the future. How you see yourself fitting into, I guess, society.
Okay, so let's try to break this down. Maybe start with the more emotional side of things. There's this whole, I don't know, mythos around owning a home in India.
It's true, like you've really made it if you own your own place.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how real is that? Is it like super ingrained in the culture?
Oh, definitely. Deeply ingrained, I'd say. Having your own property, it's like the symbol of stability, success, maybe even a legacy to pass down. It's powerful stuff. It can really sway your choices.
But then, I guess the practical side of things kicks in, because buying a house in India, especially in those big cities, it's expensive.
It is, yeah.
We're talking like massive down payments, all the registration fees, stamp duty. It's enough to make anyone think twice.
Yeah, and that's just the beginning, right? You got to think about maintenance, repairs, furnishing. It all adds up. It's way more than just the price tag on the house.
Right. So I can definitely see why renting might look, I don't know, tempting, especially if you really value flexibility.
Oh, yeah, big time.
Like, what if your job changes or you just decide, hey, I want to try living in a different neighborhood? Moving so much simpler when you're not like trying to sell a house, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And let's not forget cash flow. A lot of the time, monthly rent is actually lower than a mortgage payment, what they call EMIs in India, right? So
Yeah.
you might have more wiggle room in your budget each month.
That's a huge plus.
Yeah.
Especially if you're, say, younger and you'd rather spend that money on experiences or travel or maybe investing in your career. You're not throwing everything at a house just yet.
Yeah, totally a valid strategy, especially, in your 20s when you're still figuring things out.
Yeah.
But here's the flip side of that. Rent, while maybe lower up front, it's a liability that never really goes away. You're kind of paying for housing like forever, even after you retire, and you never actually own anything.
That's a sobering thought.
Yeah.
You're not building that long-term asset, right?
Yeah.
The potential for appreciation that makes buying so attractive in the first place.
And you don't have much control, right? You're kind of stuck playing by the landlord's rules. Maybe you can't, repaint or knock down a wall or whatever you want.
So it really is this classic trade-off.
Yeah.
The flexibility of renting versus that feeling of truly owning your space.
So how do we start unraveling this for our listeners, especially with all the unique quirks of the Indian market? Well, one thing that's really interesting is how often people talk about property appreciation in India as a major reason to buy. Like some experts say you could see 8-10% returns per year. That's way more than most investments.
Okay, so that's definitely a number that'll make people pay attention. But doesn't that also mean prices are higher to begin with?
Totally. Yeah. It's kind of a double-edged sword. Huge potential returns, but the barrier to entry is pretty high, like that down payment we were talking about. Even bigger in a market where property values are already so high.
Yeah, so it's not as simple as, just buy because prices go up. You have to really weigh that potential against, well, where you are financially, right? And how much risk you're comfortable with.
Right. And that's where I think, those emotions come back into play. For some people, that feeling of security, that sense of pride that comes with owning a home, it's worth the risk. It goes beyond just the numbers.
But then for others, that same, I don't know, emotional weight might be tied to the freedom of renting. Maybe they'd rather have experiences than possessions, or they're not ready to be stuck in one place.
Exactly. And I think the important thing is to realize there's no one right answer, What's right for one person might be totally wrong for someone else. It all depends on your own personal situation, goals, and values.
So I think that's a really key takeaway for our listeners. There's no shame in renting, even if you technically could afford to buy. It's about making the choice that fits your life, not some societal pressure.
I agree. And that's what we're here to do, right? Help people understand all the little details in the big picture so they can make a decision that feels right for them.
So we've kind of set the stage, talked about the emotional side, and dipped our toes into the financial stuff. Where do we go from here? What are the specific things our listeners should be thinking about as they're, weighing this decision?
Well, one thing we should really dig into is those upfront costs we mentioned earlier. The
Yeah.
down payment, registration fees, stamp duty, all that stuff that comes with actually buying a property. These costs can be really significant, especially in a market like India where, property values tend to be on the higher side.
Right, yeah. It's not exactly pocket change, is it?
No, not at all. We're talking big numbers that require serious planning
Right.
and budgeting.
It's like a ripple effect. That initial purchase price sends these like shockwaves through your whole financial plan. So I guess let's break this down a bit more for our listeners. What kind of down payment realistically should somebody be ready for in the Indian market?
Usually you're looking at around 10-20% of the property value as a down payment. Now, that might not sound like a lot, but we're talking about properties worth, crores of rupees sometimes. So even 10% can be a huge amount of money.
Let's say, just as an example, you're looking at a pretty, standard apartment in a big city, priced at maybe 50 lakhs. That means a down payment of at least like 5 lakhs.
Right.
And that's just to, I guess, get started.
Right. And then you add on all the other costs like those registration fees and stamp duty, and that can be another like 5-7% on top of that.
Whoa, okay. So you're talking about potentially spending over 10 lakhs before you even get the keys.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is where a lot of people, they get caught off guard. They focus on the monthly EMI thinking, okay, if I can handle that payment, I can afford it. But they don't always realize the impact of all those upfront costs.
It's kind of like trying to run a marathon without, training properly. You might be okay during the actual race, but those first few miles are going to hit you hard if you're not prepared.
That's a great analogy. And this is why it's so important to really have a handle on your finances before you even start looking at houses. How much have you saved? What's your debt to income ratio like? Can you really afford those upfront costs without putting yourself in a bad spot financially?
Yeah, you got to answer those questions honestly before you, dive headfirst into homeownership. Don't let the excitement of buying a place make you forget about reality.
Exactly. And this is where those experts we mentioned earlier can be really helpful. Financial advisors, real estate agents, they can help you assess your situation, run the numbers, and figure out what you can actually afford.
Because it's better to be realistic from the start than to, end up struggling to make those payments later on.
Absolutely. And remember, we're really just scratching the surface here. There are so many other financial things to think about, like interest rates, loan terms, property taxes. But for now, I think the main takeaway is don't underestimate those upfront costs.
It's easy to get caught up in the dream of, owning your own place. But you got to be prepared financially before you, jump in.
Right. And this is just one piece of the puzzle. We still have a lot to cover when it comes to comparing renting and buying in India.
So, okay, we've talked about those, kind of scary upfront costs. But what about the stuff that keeps coming up month after month? Aren't those ongoing expenses a big deal too when you're, trying to decide whether to rent or buy?
Yeah.
Especially thinking long term.
Definitely, yeah. It's super easy to get hung up on that initial price, that big number. But the truth is, owning a home, it comes with a whole bunch of expenses that, keep coming back. And that can really affect your budget.
So, what kind of ongoing costs are we talking about specifically, just so our listeners, know what to expect?
Okay, well, first you've got your mortgage payments, or EMIs, as they're called in India, right? Those are usually spread out over 15, 20 years. And they include both the money you borrowed, the principal, and the interest you're paying on that. And depending on the size of your loan and what interest rates are like, those monthly payments, they can be a lot.
Yeah, that's a pretty big commitment. You're basically saying, okay, this chunk of my income, it's spoken for the foreseeable future.
Right, exactly. And it's not even just about, the EMI itself. It's about how that payment affects everything else financially. Can you still save for retirement, invest in your kids' education, do all the other things you want to do financially, even with those payments going out each month?
It's about finding that balance, right? Making sure housing costs don't totally take over your life.
Exactly. And then on top of the mortgage, you've got property taxes too. And those, well, they can be different depending on where you live and how big your property is.
Oh, and don't forget maintenance and repairs. Those can be totally unpredictable and often expensive.
Ugh, yeah. Tell me about it. Leaky roof, busted plumbing, termites, all that fun stuff. It can really sneak up on you and drain your savings.
It's almost like owning a car, isn't it? You've got the regular maintenance, oil changes and all that, but then, bam, something major breaks. And it's like, whoa, where'd that come from?
Uh-huh. Yeah, that's a good comparison. And just like with a car, the older your house gets, the more likely you are to have those big expensive problems.
So it's not enough to just like do the math on the mortgage payment. You got to factor in those potential repair costs too, right?
Yeah.
Because that can really add up if you're not ready for it.
Absolutely. And this is another area where, renting can sometimes seem like the better option, at least for a while.
Because if you're renting, the landlord's usually the one who deals with maintenance,
Yeah.
right? You don't have to stress about a leaky faucet or a broken appliance.
Yeah. And that can be such a relief, especially for people who don't have, a ton of money saved up for unexpected stuff.
It's like having a, I don't know, safety net built in. You're not going to suddenly get hit with some huge repair bill.
Right. But of course, there's a trade-off. You're paying for that peace of mind in a way through your rent. And like we were saying before, rent, it's this like never-ending cost. You could be paying for housing forever and never actually own anything.
So it comes back to that really fundamental question, doesn't it? Do you value having that financial flexibility and, not worrying about maintenance as much in the short term? Or do you go for the long-term investment of owning and building equity?
And there really isn't a right or wrong answer, It all depends on your own situation, how much risk you're comfortable with, what you want to do financially in the long run.
So we've looked at the money side of things, both, those initial costs and the stuff that keeps coming up. But there's more to it than just money, right? There's that whole emotional side of owning a home, that feeling of, I don't know, putting down roots, building something that's really yours.
Totally. And that's what makes this whole thing really interesting, I think, because for so many people, that emotional pull, it's just as strong as the financial stuff. Maybe even stronger.
It's that sense of pride, right? Like, I did this. This is mine. I've got a place to call home, a place to build a life and make memories.
Exactly. And there's also this feeling of freedom that comes with owning,
Yeah.
You're not stuck following some landlord's rules. You can paint the walls whatever color you want, redo the kitchen, plant a garden. You're in control.
It's like a blank canvas. You can make it completely yours, reflect your style, your personality.
And for a lot of people, that's super important. They want their home to be an extension of themselves, a place where they can just be.
It's not just a house. It's like a sanctuary, somewhere you can just recharge and be yourself. And that's hard to put a price tag on.
It really is. And it's something you don't always get when you're renting. You might have a great apartment, perfect location, but you're still limited.
Yeah, it's always in the back of your mind that it's not really yours. You're just there for a while.
Right. And that can be kind of a bummer if you really want that feeling of ownership, that sense of permanence.
So how do you even start to, like, weigh those emotional things against the financial stuff? How do you figure out if those emotional benefits are, I don't know, worth the risk?
That's a tough one, honestly. I think it boils down to your own values, what's important to you, what matters most. Is it having financial security, being flexible, or is it about owning something, putting down roots, maybe even leaving something for your kids someday?
You got to really know yourself, right? Figure out what makes you happy, what fits into your big picture, where you want to be in life.
Exactly. And you also have to be open to the idea that those things might change, What's important to you in your 20s might not be as important in your 30s or 40s.
Like maybe when you're younger, you want that freedom of renting. But as you get older, maybe you start a family. Then that stability of owning a place starts to feel more appealing.
Right. It's about being okay with those changes and adjusting your, housing choices as you go. There's nothing wrong with changing your mind or realizing that what worked before maybe doesn't work anymore.
Be honest with yourself. Look at where you are now, and then make a decision that fits what you need and what you want.
And don't forget, there are people who can help you with this. Don't be afraid to talk to a financial advisor, a real estate agent, even friends or family who've already gone through this whole process.
Yeah, buying a house or even just deciding to rent long term, it's a big deal. It's worth getting advice from people who can, help you out.
Definitely. And it's also good to remember that it's not like, once you choose, that's it forever. You might rent for a few years, then buy later. Or the other way around.
It's all about finding what works for you. There's no one right answer for everyone.
Exactly. And it should be fun, too, whether you're, looking at places online or going to open houses. Enjoy the process of finding a place that feels like home.
Because at the end of the day, that's what really matters, right? Finding the place where you can, live your best life, be comfortable, be happy.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And that's actually a perfect way to lead into the last part of our deep dive. We'll be talking about some specific strategies for figuring this whole thing out and finding the best option for you, whether you're leaning towards renting or buying.
Welcome back to the deep dive. After like really digging into all this, it's kind of hit me how this whole rent versus buy thing, it's way more than just numbers. It's almost like philosophical.
It really is, yeah. It's about figuring out what you want your life to look like and then making financial decisions that, help you get there. What's important to you? Where do you want to be in 5, 10, 20 years? And does renting or buying get you closer to that?
It's exciting, but also kind of scary how big of a choice this is. It's not just about finding a roof, it's about your whole future, you know?
Exactly. And that's what's so great about, having these conversations. We can go beyond those like super simple pieces of advice you hear all the time. Renting is throwing money away, or buy a house as soon as you can. It's way more complicated than that.
Yeah, for sure. Way more nuanced. And we've been talking about India specifically, right? With all the unique stuff going on there, like that potential for property values to like skyrocket those 8–10% returns we talked about, that's tempting.
Oh yeah, definitely tempting. But we talked about the other side of that too, right? The big upfront costs, those EMIs that can go on forever, all that maintenance stuff that can pop up out of nowhere.
It's about seeing the whole picture,
Yes.
the good and the bad. So you can make a smart choice. And I think what's become really clear is that you got to know what you want. What are your priorities?
Absolutely. Like we were saying before, self-awareness is key. So let's say you're someone who loves flexibility. You might move for work or just because you feel like it. Maybe renting, even if you're in your 30s or older, makes sense for you. You're not tied down.
But then there are people who really value that sense of ownership, building something that's theirs, customizing it, making it their own. For those people, maybe those EMIs feel more like, I don't know, an investment in their happiness, not just a financial burden.
It's so interesting how, like, our money and our emotions get all mixed up, especially with something like housing.
Yeah.
And those generic advice things never really take that into account.
Nope, not at all.
Mm.
And I think what we've done here is give our listeners the tools to ask themselves the right questions, not what should I do, but what's important to me.
And they're not alone in this. We talked about getting advice from professionals, and I want to emphasize that again. Talk to a financial advisor, a real estate agent. They can help you navigate all the complicated stuff and make a decision that's actually good for you.
Yeah, don't be afraid to ask for help. It's like, I don't know, having a guide when you're climbing a mountain. You don't have to do it alone.
I love that. And as you're figuring things out, whether you're, looking at places online or going to open houses, keep those big questions in mind. What does home really mean to you?
How can your housing choice, whether it's renting or buying, help you live the life you want? Something to think about as we wrap up our deep dive today.
We've looked at all the angles, the financial stuff, the emotional stuff. Now it's up to you to take all this information and, figure out what works for you.
So to all our listeners, happy house hunting. Whether you're team rent or team buy, we know you'll find the perfect place.
And remember, this deep dive was just for informational purposes, not financial advice. Always talk to a qualified professional before you make any big financial decisions.